What happens when your own wife turns your body into a running joke and a weapon in every argument? How far can a funny insult about a husband's little bells spread before it stops being private and starts breaking something permanent? This is how I went from the clown in her story to the calm man watching her read legal papers in a crowded lobby. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. My name is Ivo Marrow, and the night my wife turned my body into a joke started like any other quiet Friday. I came home from the office, hung my badge on the hook by the door, and listened for my daughter's footsteps before taking off my shoes. When I did not hear her running, I knew Mila was already fixed on a cartoon and that Sienna was in what she called prep mode. Her voice came from the kitchen, bright and sharp, every sentence carrying the energy she saved for when a camera might be nearby. Gabe and Lila were our closest mutual friends on paper, but really they were part of her crowd. They were loud, quick, always ready to turn anything into content. She had invited them for cards, drinks, and what she called unfiltered truth hour. I had heard that phrase enough to know it meant she wanted an audience. When I stepped into the kitchen, she was lining bottles on the counter like props, arranging them for a possible shot, while Gabe scrolled his phone and Lila laughed at something she had just heard. Garlic from the pasta I was finishing mixed with her perfume, and the room felt less like home and more like a set. I stayed with my routine. I stirred the sauce, checked the timer, and asked about their day in a calm voice. Sienna talked about her spin class and a new reel on brutal honesty in couples. She said her followers loved when she said exactly what she thought about her man, and she added that some people could not handle a woman speaking plainly. Nobody needed her to say my name to understand who she meant. I let the comments slide past and focused on serving dinner without burning anything. It was easier to pretend she was just careless. Dinner looked normal. We ate, Gabe praised the food, Lila told a short work story, and Mila squeezed herself into the conversation just long enough to describe an art project at school. When her eyes began to droop, I walked her down the hallway, helped her brush her teeth, and listened while she explained how her favorite marker kept drying out because she forgot to close the cap. I promised new markers, tucked her in, and waited until her breathing slowed before switching off the lamp. That small routine still felt like solid ground. Back in the kitchen, the mood had shifted. Plates were pushed aside, and a deck of cards sat in the middle of the table. Sienna had her phone propped against a mug, camera angled at the group. She said it was only for background shots, and that she would cut anything we did not like. Experience had already taught me that cut sometimes meant save for later, but refusing would have turned into a new story about me hating fun, so I sat and picked up my cards. The game was a truth or challenge deck with prompts about trust and power. Each time someone drew a card, Sienna leaned closer and gave a little speech about honesty and how her audience loved the real story. At first the questions were harmless, forgotten chores, small annoyances, silly habits. Then a card asked who held more power in the relationship. Gabe joked that Sienna obviously ran our house because she had more followers than I had coworkers. Lila agreed and said her personality was too big for anyone to argue with. Sienna took that as a starting point. She gave a slow, practiced smile, checked the camera angle with a tiny glance, and raised her hand in front of her face, fingers pinched together like she held something small. She said, in a light joking tone, that my little bells were too small to argue with her, that when a man's bells were that tiny he should not try to raise his voice. She gave her pinched fingers a little shake like a bell and laughed. Gabe's laugh burst out first, sharp and surprised. Lila bent over the table, clapping and repeating the words, already turning them into a polished line. The sound that left my own throat did not feel like a real laugh. It was the practice noise you make when you stumble in public and insist you are fine. Heat crept up my neck, but I kept my eyes on the cards in my hand. Keeping my face still felt like the only control I had in that moment. Sienna repeated the line for the camera, adjusting a word until it sounded smooth. She said her followers always asked how she stayed in control during fights, and now she finally had a fun answer. She mentioned a possible caption about tiny bells and men who should not ring too loudly. Each repetition scraped a little more skin off my dignity, but there was no safe way to say that in front of people who had already decided to laugh. Gabe's laughter faded. Lila kept insisting this was the kind of honesty that would make Sienna blow up online. Nobody told her she had gone too far. When the game ended, I cleared plates while Sienna stayed at the table scrolling through her recordings, replaying the moment and trimming the clip. At the door, Gabe gave my shoulder a friendly slap and said I was a good sport. Lila hugged Sienna and said she could not wait to see the edit. After they left, the apartment felt crowded with something invisible. The chairs were empty, but the words still sat there. In the hallway, away from the kitchen light, I finally told Sienna that the joke had hurt. I kept my voice even and my hands still. I said that turning my body into a public punchline felt like crossing a line. She replied that she had only been joking, that only insecure men took that kind of humor personally, and that if I trusted her, I would not try to control her words. She added that this level of honesty was what her audience expected, and that my discomfort was a me problem, not an us problem. Then she walked to the bedroom and started changing clothes, drawers opening and closing, without waiting for more from me. I stood alone in the hallway, letting the quiet return. Then I took out my phone. In the Notes app, I wrote the date, Gabe and Lila's names, and a simple line. First little Belle's joke, filmed. On the screen, it looked plain, but to me, it felt like pinning something in place. After that, I opened the calendar and created a small, silent reminder for the following week. I titled it Harbor Cafe, 7:45 p.m., with no alert sound and no description, just a thin stripe across an evening no one else knew about. When I finally went into the bedroom, Sienna was already under the covers, her back turned toward my side. I set the phone on the nightstand, screen down. For a second it glowed, showing the new reminder, then went dark. Somewhere down the hall, the fridge hummed and a pipe ticked. As I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, the phone gave a tiny vibration to confirm the reminder, a private signal in the quiet room that marked the first small line I was drawing while my wife scrolled herself towards sleep. The next morning, I woke up with that same dull tightness in my chest, the kind that made breathing feel slightly too shallow. From the outside, nothing had changed. I still got up first, made coffee, packed Mila's snack, and checked the weather on my phone. Sienna came out of the bedroom scrolling, her hair up in a loose knot, wearing a gym hoodie that advertised the studio where she taught spin. She moved around me in the kitchen like I was part of the furniture. If she felt any discomfort about the previous night, she did not show it. While Mila ate cereal, Sienna talked about her morning class. She said she wanted to try a new Real Talk section at the end of the workout, where she would ask people to share something they wanted to stop apologizing for. She added that she might use our card game as an example. She did not say which part. She did not need to. Mila listened without understanding and asked if she could come watch one day. Sienna said the class was for grown-ups with strong legs and strong opinions, then gave me a quick glance to see if that landed. I kept my face still, kissed Mila on the head, and said I had to go. After dropping Mila at school, I drove to the gym to pick up a new access card they were issuing to family members. When I walked in, music thumped through the walls from the spin studio. Through the glass, I saw Sienna on the bike at the front, lights low, bodies moving in time to the beat. She looked alive in a way she rarely did at home anymore, voice loud and arms raised. At the end of the set, she slowed her pedaling and stepped off, pulling her microphone down. From the hallway, I watched her talking to a small cluster of riders. Among them was a man I recognized from her social media, Rafe, the star coach everyone seemed to like. She said something, then shaped her fingers in that same pinch gesture from our kitchen, making a tiny shaking motion. I could not hear the words through the glass, but I saw the posture, the small twist of her mouth, and the way the group reacted. A couple of them laughed and leaned in. Rafe grinned and mimed ringing an invisible bell above his head. It did not take much imagination to guess which line she was testing on live bodies now. I stepped away before she could see me and made my way to the front desk. While the receptionist printed the new card, I could still feel the vibration of the bass in my chest, like another muscle being worked without my permission. The receptionist handed me the card with a polite smile. I slipped it into my wallet and told myself that maybe I was wrong, that maybe the gesture could have been about something else. The part of me that still wanted to believe in accidents hung on to that thought for as long as it could. At the office, the air felt cooler and flatter. Keyboards clicked, phones rang, and the usual hum of the open-plan floor wrapped around my cubicle. I greeted a few coworkers, sat down, and logged in. For the first hour, I lost myself in tickets, password resets, slow printers, and locked accounts. This was a world where problems had clear forms, and each step either worked or did not. No laughter, no applause, no public shame. Just tasks. Around mid-morning, I heard a small burst of chuckling a few desks away. When I glanced over, 2 colleagues were huddled over a phone. One of them, Tyler, glanced up at me, then quickly looked back down, his smile fading a little. Something in my spine stiffened. I turned back to my monitor and forced myself to keep working. A minute later, my own phone vibrated softly on the desk. I picked it up and saw a notification from a group chat someone had added me to once for a team outing. The message preview showed a thumbnail of Sienna's face mid-laugh, text overlaid at the bottom. My little bells are too small to argue with me. I tapped the notification. The video was a clipped version of last night's card game. Sienna sat at our kitchen table, fingers in that pinched shape. My face was visible in the corner, smiling in a way that was not real. The audio cut right after the line, leaving a half-second of Lila's laughter. Underneath, there were already a few reactions. Laughing emojis, a bell emoji, someone saying they loved this level of honesty. One message, from a coworker who did not know me well, joked that at least I must be used to taking instructions. I stared at the screen long enough that it dimmed and then went black. Instead of replying, I opened a new spreadsheet on my computer. I named it something plain, household log, and set up 4 columns: date, location, event, witnesses. In the first row, I put last night's game, our apartment, the Little Bells joke being filmed, and the names of Gabe and Lila. In the next row, I wrote that the clip had been posted, listed the group chat, and noted that at least 2 coworkers had seen it. I did not add adjectives, only facts. Near lunch, my manager, Owen, stopped by my desk. He was a quiet man, the kind who rarely raised his voice. He asked if I had a minute. In the small IT room, he closed the door and said he wanted to check in. He had seen a short video in a mutual social thread and recognized my kitchen, my wife's face, and my name in the caption. He said he was not there to judge my life, but he wanted to make sure I was okay, and to remind me that if anything at home ever started to affect my work or safety, the company had resources. He chose his words carefully, like someone handling glass. I told him I appreciated the concern, that my work would not suffer, and that things at home were simply noisy right now. I added that I was still meeting my deadlines, and that I had no intention of letting anything change that. He nodded, said he believed me, and suggested we schedule a brief follow-up check for the next week at the cafe down the street. Off the clock, just to talk. He called it an informal meeting, personal, not official. When he sent the calendar invitation later, he labeled it Meeting, Personal, Harbor Cafe, 7:45 p.m. Back at my desk, I accepted the invite and set the alert to silent. On my phone calendar, my own Harbor Cafe 7:45 p.m. reminder now sat next to Owen's event, overlapping like 2 transparent sheets. The shape of that evening became more solid, its edges darker. On the way home, I stopped at the neighborhood pharmacy to pick up something for Mila's cough. I stood in line behind a couple of people scrolling their phones. The woman in front of me turned around and did a small double take when she saw my face. Then she smiled and said she followed Sienna online. She said she had seen the clip and that my wife was savage but hilarious. She added, with a small chuckle, that now every time she saw me she would think of bells. She did not lower her voice. The cashier gave me a quick, uncomfortable glance when I stepped forward. I paid, thanked her, and walked out into the cool air with the small paper bag in my hand. On the sidewalk, I leaned against a brick wall for a moment, pretending to check messages. Instead, I opened the household log on my phone and added a new line. Pharmacy queue, neighbor repeated joke, public spread confirmed. When I got home, Mila ran to meet me in the hall, coughing once and then showing me a drawing she had made. Bells hung at the top of the paper because she said they were pretty and loud. I smiled and told her I liked them. Behind her, in the kitchen, Sienna laughed at something on her phone. As I set the medicine on the counter, my own phone buzzed again. The notification at the top of the screen read, Meeting, Personal, Harbor Cafe, 7:45 p.m., now 3 days away. I dismissed the alert without opening it. In the same second, Sienna's phone lit up with a group chat called Spin Fam, the preview showing my face clumsily edited onto a tiny bell cartoon, and I understood that the joke had become a character I would not be able to outrun with a simple conversation. Saturday at Gabe and Lila's place started out soft and ordinary for me, at least on the surface. I helped Mila pick out a sweater that did not itch, packed a small bag with snacks she liked, and told myself this was just another night with friends. The rooftop terrace at their building was popular with half the city, which meant there would be plenty of people and plenty of other conversations to hide in. On the drive over, Mila hummed part of a song from school, and I focused on the sound of her voice instead of the bell emoji that had become stuck in my mind. Gabe met us in the lobby and greeted us with his usual loud energy. Upstairs, the apartment already buzzed. Music played, people laughed, and the smell of food filled the rooms. Sienna moved through the space like a host, even though it was not our home. She had one arm around Lila and her phone in her other hand, scanning the room for angles. She introduced herself to new faces as a creator who talked about relationships without filters. I stayed near the kitchen island at first, helping Gabe refill bowls and trays, while Mila found a few children near a pile of toys and settled in. As the sky outside shifted from gold to deep blue, more people arrived. The living room and rooftop terrace blended into one big social circle. On the terrace, strings of lights glowed above scattered chairs and a long table lined with bottles and bowls. I stood near the railing, watching the city lights and keeping an eye on Mila through the balcony door. Every so often, Sienna drifted past, laughing with someone new, bells on her bracelet chiming lightly when she moved her wrist. The sound made my shoulders tense even when she was not looking at me. At some point, Lila clapped her hands and called everyone to gather on the terrace for a toast. People shuffled and turned, raising glasses or cups. I stayed near the back with a plastic cup of soda, close enough to hear, but far enough that most cameras would not catch my face clearly. Gabe said something about being grateful for friends who showed up. Then he handed the moment to Sienna, who loved moments. She stepped forward to the center of the terrace, lifted her glass, and said she wanted to make a special toast about power in relationships. She talked about women owning their voices, about not shrinking for fragile egos. Heads nodded along. It was the kind of speech people liked to hear at parties. I tried to believe she would leave it there. Then I saw the familiar pinch of her fingers as she raised her hand. She told the crowd that her husband had the sweetest little bells in the world and that they were far too small to ring loudly during arguments. She said that when a man's bells were that tiny, he should let his woman lead the way. She made the same small shaking gesture in the air, wrists loose, fingers close together. Laughter broke around her in waves. Some people laughed hard, some gave polite smiles, a few looked down. A group near the middle started repeating the phrase, turning it into a soft chant that rippled across the terrace and slid under my skin. Phones were everywhere. I saw at least 2 people near the front angle their cameras toward her as she spoke. Lila held her own phone up high, catching Sienna's face, the string lights, and the crowd reaction. Someone added a bell sound from their device, timing it with the little hand gesture. The noise almost drowned out the quieter part of my mind that kept saying this might be the clip she had wanted all along. My face grew hot, but I stood still, eyes on the city beyond the railing. After the toast, people broke into smaller groups again. Some guests clapped me on the shoulder with a strange kind of awkward sympathy, as if I had stepped into a comedy bit by mistake. One man joked that at least now I had a nickname. Another said I must be very secure to tolerate this level of honesty. Their words floated around me like light objects. In my chest, everything felt heavy. When I caught Sienna's eye once, she smiled brightly and acted as if she had just done me a favor. Later, in the kitchen, while I poured water for Mila, I quietly told Sienna that the toast had crossed a line. I kept my voice calm and low. I said the room had been full of cameras, that the chant had reached people beyond our friend circle, and that turning a private part of me into a brand moment felt like more than just honesty. She rolled her eyes, said the line killed with the crowd, and added that her audience loved when she did not protect male ego. She repeated that only insecure men were bothered by jokes, and that I was lucky she was making me memorable. Then she turned back to Lila to discuss where to place text on the eventual reel. The next afternoon there was a craft event in the community center hall. Mila had been looking forward to it for a week, so I took her, even though my head still buzzed with the memory of those lights and that laughter. The hall smelled like glue, paper, and cheap coffee. Tables were set up with colored paper, stickers, and markers. Children moved from station to station while parents hovered nearby. It should have been a safe place, a small bubble where the rest of my life could not follow. I stood near the coffee urn, watching Mila decorate a cardboard star with strips of shiny tape. 2 mothers from the neighborhood stood a few feet away, cups in hand, scrolling their phones between comments about school and schedules. One mentioned Sienna's handle and said she had finally seen the famous Bell speech. She laughed, saying it was brutal but honest, and wondered aloud if I ever got tired of being the punchline. The other replied that at least Sienna was airing everything openly, and that many women wished they could say what she did. One of them turned her phone slightly, and I recognized the rooftop terrace in the frame. The video had already been trimmed and captioned. Sienna raised her glass. The tiny hand gesture froze for a second in the edit, and big letters at the bottom spelled out a line about little bells and who gets to argue. Sound from the crowd played through the tiny speaker, thin but still sharp. I watched them replay it and realized this was no longer a story confined to one night. It had become a piece of moving content, traveling between hands. I did not step in or correct them. Instead, I walked to the other end of the hall and stood near a window that looked out onto the parking lot. From that angle, I could see Mila, still focused on her star, and Sienna arriving late at the far door, wearing workout clothes and a camera clipped to her shirt. She walked straight to a group of younger parents, laughed, and leaned into their circle. The phone that held the video traveled to her, and she watched herself with a pleased expression, then mimed the gesture again, smaller this time. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I took it out, moved to a quieter corner, and opened a new note thread addressed to myself. I titled it Follow Up. In the first entry, I wrote the date, rooftop terrace, bell toast recorded, crowd response, and the community hall replay. I added names and brief descriptions of who had been present. Each word felt like a small weight placed on a scale I could not yet see fully, but I knew I needed numbers before any balance could be measured. As I finished typing, a brief burst of white light caught my eye in the reflection of the window. A mother standing near Sienna had lifted her phone and taken a photo or a short video. In the glass, I saw Sienna laughing beside Rafe, who had shown up late for his niece, and both of them leaning close while the phone camera pointed at their faces. The flash flickered once, then again, while the tiny red recording dot glowed on the screen. My hand tightened around my own phone. The follow-up thread sat open, the cursor blinking, as that new clip began its quiet path into yet another set of hands. Roman and Belinda's backyard always looked like a scene from an old summer postcard. String lights looped between trees, mismatched lawn chairs circled a big grill, and music from some past decade hummed low from a portable speaker. When Mila and I walked through the side gate that Sunday, the air smelled like charcoal and cut grass. She ran ahead toward a group of cousins near a plastic slide. I followed more slowly, carrying a bowl of salad that would probably sit untouched next to the mountain of meat. Sienna was already there, standing near the grill with a drink in her hand, hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that showed off her face for any possible camera. Belinda hovered beside her, waving a pair of tongs as she talked, laughing loudly. Roman sat in a lawn chair like a king on a small throne, watching everything with narrowed eyes and a half smile. Therese, my mother, sat near the back of the yard under a tree, a paper plate on her lap, quietly observing the scene. When they saw us, Belinda called out that the star of the show had arrived. I hoped for a second that she meant Mila. Then she tapped her phone and said she needed the Little Bells guy to stand where the light hit his face, because she wanted a picture for context. Sienna laughed and told her to stop, but her eyes shone, not with embarrassment, but with satisfaction. Roman chuckled and patted the chair beside him, telling me to sit and relax. I sat. Mila ran past with a water gun, already wet, already happy. That small, normal joy helped me breathe. Plates went around, people filled them, and the usual small talk flowed. Work, weather, school, gossip. I answered questions politely. At first, the joke hovered near the edges of conversation, not fully mentioned. Then someone asked Sienna how her truth content was going. Belinda's head snapped up like she had been waiting for that line. She demanded that Sienna tell the family about the famous Bell speech. Sienna gave a small, fake, modest protest, then stepped into the open space between the chairs and the grill as if it were a tiny stage. She retold the rooftop toast, describing the string lights, the crowd, and how she had finally put into words why arguments in our marriage were pointless. She repeated the line about my little bells being too small to argue with her, shaping her fingers into that same small ringing motion. The laughter this time was louder, warmer, because these people loved her and trusted her version of everything. Belinda clapped and said she had almost spit out her drink when she first watched the clip. Roman laughed too, then looked at me with a smirk and said a man in my position had two choices: fix the problem or accept it and be grateful such a honest woman still bothered with him. He did not say exactly what he thought the problem was. He did not need to. I felt my ears heat, but I kept my voice even when I spoke. I said I did not mind jokes in private, but hearing that line repeated in front of family, spread online and turned into a chant, felt like more than honesty. I said I wanted it to stop, especially around Mila. The yard went quieter for a breath. Belinda snorted and said she hated sensitive men. She called my request an attempt to control Sienna's voice. She announced that women had been silenced for too long and that finally one of them was brave enough to say what many thought. Sienna nodded and said some men wanted a pretty partner, not a real one, and that she refused to shrink to protect my ego. Roman leaned back in his chair and warned that constantly trying to shut her down could force her to protect herself and her brand. He used the words protect herself slowly, like a test balloon. At the edge of the circle, Therese cleared her throat. She said in a calm voice that love did not usually sound like public humiliation, that there was a difference between honesty and cruelty, and that once children heard these things, you could not unring that bell. Belinda rolled her eyes and said older generations did not understand modern relationships. She added that if I felt humiliated, that was a sign I needed to work on myself, not a reason for Sienna to change what made her content successful. Some relatives laughed with Belinda. Others looked down at their plates. Nobody openly sided with me or with Therese. The joke had become a family bit, a shared reference that everyone understood. To question it was to step outside the group. It was easier for them to let the story harden than to admit it might be wrong. Later, while the children roasted marshmallows, I stood near the back fence with Therese. She watched Mila try to toast her marshmallow without dropping it into the coals and said, in a low voice, that she had seen this pattern before. One person turned the other into a character, then built a whole world around that character, and eventually forgot there was an actual human under the costume. She told me again to write things down, not because she wanted a fight, she said, but because memory alone could not stand against repeated, polished stories. That evening, after we drove home and put Mila to bed, I sat at the small desk in the living room with my laptop open. I entered a new line into the household log: Roman and Belinda's barbecue, joke repeated as family bit, Roman's fix or accept comment, Teresa's quiet objection. I saved the file and backed it up to Archive A and Archive B, watching the small progress bar move across the screen. A few days later, in the school pickup line, the sun sat low and bright over the playground fence. Parents waited beside idle cars, checking watches and phones. I leaned against our car, hands in my pockets, watching Mila come out with her class. She walked slower than usual, her backpack hanging crooked. When she reached me, she did not launch into her usual story about the day. She just slipped her hand into mine and held it tighter than normal. As we drove, she looked out the window and then asked in a timid voice if there was something wrong with me. I asked what she meant, keeping my tone gentle. She said she had heard Aunt Belinda tell someone that my bells were too small to argue with Mommy and that everybody laughed. She asked if that meant there was something wrong with my body and if that was why Mommy always seemed mad at me. The question felt like someone sliding a thin blade under my ribs. I gripped the steering wheel and let a breath out slowly before answering. I told her that nothing was wrong with my body, that grown-ups sometimes use cruel jokes to feel powerful, and that none of it was her fault. I added that whatever happened between her parents, we both loved her very much. She swallowed and nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on some invisible point ahead. When we parked outside our building, she unbuckled and asked if she should apologize to Mommy for laughing at the bell joke once at the barbecue. I told her she did not need to apologize for anything, that children only repeat what adults teach them. As she stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw an incoming call with no number, just the word private on the screen. It vibrated against my palm while Mila waited at the bottom of the stairs, looking back to see if I was coming. I watched the word private blink, thought of Roman's warning about Sienna protecting herself, thought of Teresa's advice about writing things down, and wondered which story that caller was about to join. The call buzzed once more, then went silent, leaving only the echo of my daughter's question hanging in the late afternoon air. The days after that felt like walking on a narrow bridge over water I could not see the bottom of. On the surface, life went on. Work, school, meals, dishes, bedtime. Underneath, something kept shifting. The private call had not left a message, but it stayed in my phone history like a quiet mark. I did not know who had called. I did not know what story they had heard. I only knew that if I kept standing still, other people would decide the shape of my life without asking me. One evening, after a small disagreement about nothing important on the surface, Sienna announced that she was tired of the heavy energy in our bedroom. She said she needed more space, more air, more light, and that my mood was suffocating her. Her exact words rolled around my head as I stood in the doorway, watching her toss clothes into a drawer. Instead of arguing, I went to the hall closet, took out a spare pillow and a folded blanket, and walked past her to the guest room. Mila stood near the bathroom holding her toothbrush. She asked why I was taking my things down the hall. I told her I had been snoring more and wanted to see if sleeping in another room would help Mommy rest better. It was not the full truth, but it was a part she could carry. The guest room smelled like old cardboard and fabric softener. Boxes lined the wall, and the thin binder labeled Utilities still sat on the desk, its spine slightly bent. I cleared a corner of the desk and set my laptop down, along with a plain notebook and a cheap pen. When I opened the laptop, the household log stared back at me, the last line about Mila's question glowing faintly. I added a new entry: moved to guest room, reason given to child, distance now visible. Then I created 2 new folders on the desktop. I named one Archive A and the other Archive B. They looked harmless, just 2 small icons. I began to drop files into Archive A. Screenshots of posts and clips, dates and names, short statements written after each event. Anything concrete, anything that did not depend on my memory alone. For Archive B, I set up a quiet sync to a cloud account under my own email. A small bar crept across the screen as each file uploaded. It was not dramatic. There were no sound effects or flashing lights. Still, watching that bar move made something in my chest loosen a little. If someone twisted the story again, at least I would not be starting from zero. In the desk drawer, behind a stack of older tax forms, I taped a small USB drive under the flap of a worn folder labeled Taxes. On the drive, I copied the same set of files and my simple written descriptions of what had happened. I kept the wording calm, almost dry. I listed who said what, where, and when. I did not throw accusations around. I did not use sharp words. I tried to write the way a careful stranger might record what they saw. When I heard footsteps in the hallway, I closed the drawer and turned the key until I felt the lock click. Later that week, at work, I took my lunch break in the parking garage instead of the break room. I sat in the car with the engine off, the air still, and scrolled through my own notes on my phone. The follow-up thread had grown longer. Rooftop toast, backyard barbecue, community hall replay, Mila's car question. Each entry had initials and dates. Looking at it all in one place, I saw a pattern that had been harder to feel while living it. The joke had become a tool, then a weapon, then a habit. It no longer needed even her full effort to hurt. It traveled on its own. I added a new line about the private call and the way Roman had used the phrase protect herself. I did not know yet who they had spoken with or what picture they had painted of me, but the pieces fit together enough that I could at least stop pretending it was only for laughs. In that silent, concrete space, I understood I could not argue my way out of this with speeches or apologies. The bridge I was on would either collapse under me one day, or I would need to move carefully towards solid ground of my own choosing. That evening, Sienna came home later than usual, smelling like the gym and a bar at the same time. She said she had met a few clients for drinks after class. While she scrolled her phone at the kitchen island, she mentioned that a friend who worked in mental health thought she should start documenting all the ways I made her feel unsafe. She said this friend had suggested she might need to talk to someone official if the power imbalance in our marriage did not improve. She looked at me over the top of her screen, waiting for a reaction she could hold up as proof. I told her, in a steady voice, that everyone had the right to make notes about their own life. I added that I was already keeping my own records, not to attack her, but to protect myself and Mila if things kept going this way. I said I wanted structure and clarity, not drama. She scoffed and called me paranoid, said my logs would not change the fact that people liked her honesty, and walked away, thumbs still moving on the screen. When she left the kitchen, Therese called. Her name lit up my phone with a small, warm glow. I stepped into the guest room and answered. She said she had been thinking about the barbecue and about how quiet Mila had been the last time she saw her. She asked how I was holding up. I told her, in simple terms, about the guest room, the folders, the tapes, and the parking garage lunch. She did not tell me I was overreacting. She said that sometimes, when one person would not stop turning the other into a joke, the only way to be heard was to move the conversation to a place where jokes did not count. She reminded me again to stay calm, to stay lawful, and to let paper carry the weight my voice could not. The next day, near the playground fence, Mila clung to my sleeve after school. She asked who she would live with if Mommy and Daddy stopped living together. I told her that grown-ups had ways to make plans for children, that those plans were supposed to keep her safe and loved, and that whatever happened between me and her mother, I would make sure she had a home and a routine. I did not say everything I was thinking. I did not mention courtrooms or agreements. I just promised I would not disappear. That night, after Mila was asleep and Sienna shut herself in the bedroom with her ring light and her phone, I sat at the guest room desk again. On the laptop screen, Archive A and Archive B waited. I opened a new simple text file and wrote one sentence at the top. I am done trying to fix this with jokes and begging. Under it, I listed the main questions I needed answered. Where Mila would sleep, how time would be divided, what limits should exist on public talk about my body, how to keep a roof over our heads without being at someone else's mercy. I did not know yet exactly how those questions would be addressed, but I knew they would not be settled at barbecues and rooftops. Before going to bed, I opened the clock app on my phone and set a new alarm. I labeled it Paper Drop 11:15 a.m. and set it to vibrate only. Then I pulled out a plain clipboard from the desk drawer and placed a blank sheet of paper on it. At the top, in neat letters, I wrote one word, statement. I left the clipboard on the desk where I would see it every time I walked into the room. The next morning, light slid through the guest room blinds and drew a pale line across the word statement. As I finished tying my shoes, the phone on the nightstand buzzed softly with the Paper Drop 11:15 a.m. reminder. The screen lit up for a moment, showing the label. I looked from the alarm to the clipboard, then said quietly to the empty room that I was done playing the part she had written for me. From now on, I would handle things properly and let the paper speak in my place. The morning everything shifted was bright and cold, with a kind of hard blue sky that made edges look sharper. Sienna thought we were meeting at the office tower for coffee before a brand collab meeting she had with a small agency upstairs. She had insisted we clear the air so she could speak her truth about our marriage on better terms. I agreed because the place and time matched the reminder that had been pulsing quietly in my phone for days. Paper Drop 11:15 a.m. I arrived early and stood in the lobby near a planter, watching people move through security. Badges beeped, heels clicked, the elevator bell chimed every few minutes. Therese sat on a bench against the wall with Mila beside her, a book in the child's hands. They were close enough for me to see them, far enough that Sienna would not notice them at first. I had told Mila only that Grandma was taking her to lunch after I finished a grown-up conversation. That was as much truth as she needed. Sienna swept into the lobby in a fitted coat, phone in her hand, Jade trailing behind with a camera ready. She kissed the air near my cheek and said we should sit and talk before she went upstairs to build her brand. Her voice bounced off the marble floor. Before I could answer, a man in a plain jacket stepped up beside her and asked her to confirm her full name. She did, thinking he was part of the agency. Instead, he handed her a thick envelope with a clear front page. The words petition for dissolution with temporary orders and a reference to online disparagement were visible from where I stood. She flipped through pages, her face draining as she read about rooftop toasts, backyard jokes, clips, captions, and the effect on Mila, all laid out in calm language. Custody schedule, temporary possession, a clause about using my body as content. She looked up at me and said I could not do this, not to her image. I told her, in a low voice, that I had warned her I would handle things properly and that from now on we would follow what the papers set out for Mila's sake. My phone vibrated once. A small notification slid across the top of the screen. File uploaded successfully. Archive B. Behind Sienna, the elevator bell chimed again as doors opened onto rows of strangers watching her stand there, envelope in hand, while I turned and walked toward the glass doors and stepped outside.